So hello, I'm Wendell Wallach. I'm in this podcast with you largely because of the last 25 years of my life when I've been in the ethics and governance of emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence and neuroscience. But the focus has heavily been on AI and the governance of AI over the last few years. I am a senior citizen at this stage of the game, and I've had a varied career. I'd like to jokingly say I've had many incarnations in one lifetime, but I had activist um, activity in the 1960s and 70s, particularly around um, racial issues and the Vietnam War. I had interests in spirituality and self-understanding and spent a couple years in India in the 1970s studying meditation and doing some relief work. I ran computer consulting companies for about a decade and a half. And then in 2001, I stepped back from that and turned over my computing companies to the employees. Um, Basically, I just gave it to them. These were largely companies in which people were making a living, a good living, but nobody was making a fortune. And the reason I had gotten into computers in the first place was I had books in my head and I hated whiteout and I hated typewriters and carbon copies and so forth, and I wanted to have a word processor. So one thing led to another, and I became a consultant in microcomputers and microcomputer networks. But for the purposes of this podcast, the most seminal part of my life was these last 20 years from 2001 on. I very soon became involved with transhumanists and others looking at emerging technologies. The transhumanists were interested in their ethics largely because they didn't want governments to block their ability to use new technologies for enhancement. My interests were really purely ethical. They were much more about what is the appropriate and inappropriate use of AI, nanotechnologies, biotechnologies. But I'm best known perhaps for a book that I wrote with Colin Allen in 2008 called Moral Machines Teaching Robots Right from Wrong. And it was really the first book to bring together many threads of research on the prospects for implementing moral decision-making faculties in computers and robots. That's at least ostensibly what the topic was, but the topic was as much about human decision-making and ethics as it was about computers. That book by now has been cited more than 2,000 times, which is rather unusual for anything other than a technical paper, which is intrinsic to a field. So we see papers about algorithms and technological approaches in which perhaps 10 or 20,000 people cite the paper, if not more. But we're pretty pleased with the amount of attention that moral machines receive. As I mentioned, my background was much broader than just whether machines could make ethical decision making, to engage in ethical decision making. On that side, I was very much caught up in the philosophical questions that surround how this changes being human, whether computational systems can actually have consciousness or theory of mind or other mental faculties that we take for granted in human beings. And my second book was about the ethics and governance of emerging technologies more broadly. And that was called A Dangerous Master, How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control. That book was written to kind of be a 100,000 word primer on the key concepts that I thought lay people would need to understand to be able to engage in the really exciting conversations around emerging technologies. But since that publication, my focus has been more and more the governance, particularly the international governance of AI, neuroscience, and other fields of research. And I think that's probably more about what we will get into in our discussion today. Perhaps one other thing to throw into this conversation is that in 2001, I was invited to join a Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics working group on technology and ethics. And within 3 years, I became chair of that working group. And that was that had a lot of monthly guests, and it became a who's who in emerging technology. So most of the big names, many of whom people now look back as fathers of varying fields, many of those big names came and visited us at Yale and gave extended presentations. Another early activity of my part was to get a Future of Life Institute grant to bring together the leaders in AI and the leaders in ethics and philosophy and engineering, ethics, and so forth, to discuss the ability for us to ensure safe and ethical AI. So that was also 3 working groups with a who's who on both the technological side and the philosophical side. And that was perhaps the first time that there were serious transdisciplinary conversations between the social scientists and the computer scientists. Among the people who were part of that working group were Stuart Russell and Yann LeCun and Gary Marcus, Daniel Kahneman, and many other people who are now identified as significant figures in AI ethics. So that's the brief overview. Happy to talk about anything that you think is seminal for us to discuss today.
Wendell, thank you very much for the thorough introduction and a little bit of background what you've been doing in the past. Yeah, I'm just gonna throw some random questions because I'm curious here and there. Maybe we can start with some AI related ones. Do you believe we underestimated the speed of AI development or overestimated our ability to guide it responsibly? Because a lot of people are freaking out, if I may say so. I mean, the general public is fearful everyone is going to lose their jobs and we're going to be all driven by AI. And yeah, maybe you can shed some light and
Well, I think we
we
have
can have.
both, I think we both underestimated and we are overestimating the development of AI. So no one perceived that we would have chat GPT or large language models, not just verbal language models, but also large language models dealing with imagery and many other capacity, that we would have that they would be quite as sophisticated as they have turned out to be. On the other hand, we are overestimating in that as remarkable as they are, they still lack some fundamental forms of intelligence. That so much intelligence could be contained in language alone was amazing. But these still are pattern recognition systems that, from my perspective, do not really have understanding, do not have consciousness, do not have intentionality and motivation, factors that are really important when you talk about human intelligence. And so far, I've seen little evidence that they will do more than simulate human intelligence in those ways which I still think is fundamentally different than actually possessing those forms of intelligence. So I've been focusing particularly on moral intelligence, which there's hardly any discussion of it at all when we talk about, let's say, artificial general intelligence, ensuring that machines can be as intelligent, if not more intelligent than humans in all respects. AI developers know that they're going to have to be trustworthy and make decent ethical decisions, but the recognition that moral intelligence is a unique and important form of intelligence. That's not fully sunk in. Let me go on for a minute because you did allude to the dangers, and of course I've focused on what can go wrong and the dangers for really my whole career. I'm not trying to scare people as much as I wanted people to give attention to these challenges and hopefully put in place appropriate safeguards and ethical constraints, if not legal constraints. And on that front, I think we've failed badly. Um, and not only have we failed, but the list of possible things that could go wrong has expanded almost as quickly as the list of the benefits. So that I think is perhaps the critical concern for us at this point. When I first started asking questions at conferences and various events, like whether people thought the benefits would far outweigh the risks over the next 25 years, most people did not give a lot of attention to the risks. If they did, they were largely concerned with superintelligence. AI getting so smart that it treated us like the equivalent of house pets, as Marvin Minsky once said. But that shifted over the years. And a few years ago at AI for Good, for example, I asked this question, and about half the people said the benefits would be of concern, and half thought the dangers and harms would perhaps supersede the benefits. But then I asked the third question, and that third question was, well, has it not been decided yet? Can we, through social engineering and ethics and regulation and so forth, and technical engineering, can we turn the tide? And that received by far the most number of votes. But I've been noticing in recent years that the sense of negativity about AI is prevailing, even as people are using it more and more, particularly in the form of these large language models, and particularly as it is getting more embedded in our culture. And that's a real concern. You mentioned the issue of technological unemployment, uh, the loss of jobs to AI, but there's also concerns over mass surveillance, over lethal autonomous weapon systems, over deep fakes, over geopolitical destabilization, over the exacerbation of inequalities. There's a long list now of things that can go wrong and probably will go wrong if we don't redirect our course in the development of AI. So, excuse me, that was a long intro, but I thought important to get that out there.
No, I'm very grateful. Thank you very much for shedding so much detail. And there's a follow-up question on this one. Because there's concern, and it's rightful because AI is outpacing a lot of things, and people are getting concerned about safety, security. Everything has been pretty much automated now through AI, whether this would be robots or language models, etc.
Yeah, that's the toolkit
And
called
it's sort
AI.
of moving in an incredibly fast pace. Who should ultimately be accountable when AI systems cause harm? Should it be developers, companies, government, or society collectively? I mean,
Well,
because we can't stop it, and it's not gonna, we're not gonna wake up tomorrow. The entire world is gonna decide, the government. Okay, let's put first all the regulations and legal aspects in place and make sure it's safety. We're just racing towards making sure that everything is done really fast because it generates money, and everyone thinks about money now rather than safety, harm, and anything else. Who is accountable, and who should be accountable for this?
well, that's a great question, and it's been around for a long time, and it's changing as the systems are changing, and as our legal systems are changing, and as the issues are changing. But The traditional form of accountability belongs to the corporations that release the technologies, and to some extent to the companies that implement those technologies within their corporate environments. There's been an attempt over the years to redirect that responsibility to somebody else, largely because AI systems are not always predictable, and at times they can act in unpredictable and destructive ways. Recognizing this, some of the corporations have tried to redirect responsibility onto users. So, for example, when um, Tesla and Elon Musk first brought out their self-driving features, they were telling drivers that you nevertheless have to sit at the steering wheel with your hand on the steering wheel, prepared to take over if some unusual situation arises. Well, you can imagine any human sitting behind a steering wheel for hours on end, not doing anything as the car drives itself. And within 24 hours of the release of that technology, there were videos on YouTube of people jumping in the back seat, cracking open champagne bottles and drinking back there while the Tesla vehicle was being driven by its automatic pilot. It was absurd to think that humans would ever be able to be responsible for vehicles once you had released that technology. And courts have pretty much maintained a recognition of that absurdity and have held the corporations responsible when the technologies fail. But let's say a corporation releases a general purpose product, and another company takes that product and modifies it in ways that it was never intended to be modified, releases it, and something goes wrong. Then that secondary company can be responsible. Furthermore, companies are not going to be able to blame the programmers because due diligence still resides with them, though a programmer may have been responsible for some flaw in the technology that was released, but the corporation is still responsible for appropriate testing and compliance. So that level of responsibility becomes clear. But now we're dealing with broader issues such as autonomous weapons systems, picking targets and launching weaponry. There you're getting into the country being responsible. And I think down the line, there are going to be concerns about countries having been responsible for not having put in place appropriate regulations because, for example, they wanted to beat out China in the competition over who would get to some technology first. So um, increasingly, the countries are responsible. The legislators who don't legislate are responsible. But whether any of them will be held culpable and liable beyond anything other than, what should I say, public opinion or how people vote in democratic societies, that's yet to be witnessed.
Yeah, I mean, at the top level, as you said, the government level, corporation level, like Tesla, because autonomous cars and I don't know, drones for military bases, etc. Yeah, maybe there's an accountability, but what about the humans that on the low level sort of ladder where they use the language models to research, to do their work, because everyone wants to be comfortable now, kind of lazy. They use it, they try to save time and money, but they input a lot of data. And I mean, we could go back to Facebook times when they basically collected all of our data, all of our pictures. They didn't ask about our permission because we signed terms and conditions without even us knowing. And I mean, the same thing will have is probably with Anthropic, Claude, or ChatGPT. They're gonna use our data because most people won't go be thorough and go to settings and set up the privacy settings and all that data goes? What if down the line AI is so sophisticated and governments or top
Sure.
level institutions gonna become so greedy that
And
they're going to take advantage of all the information you've shared and sort of threat people? And we're gonna have a communist sort of environment again because through AI, who is gonna be accountable for that? I mean, how can we make people aware of it? Because
well,
let's not be paranoid, but yeah, I mean, it's quite
well,
interesting
sure,
to
my
know.
responsibility to the best of our ability is to educate, but we may be limited in the influence and the amount of education we can distribute. And that may be relative to who we are and where we sit in the society. So the education is out there, but whether people are getting educated about the lack of reliability or the degree to which they can and cannot rely on the technology, that's hard to say. But I think the information is out there, and people who totally rely on what the technology gives as an output should be penalized if something goes wrong. If they are students and they submit papers written by ChatGPT and there are flaws in those papers and they never checked that, then they should rightfully be flunked in those courses because they aren't learning anything. They're just basically relying on ChatGPT. There's a very famous story early on of a lawyer who used ChatGPT to write a brief for him. And he submitted that brief, and it cited 6 cases that did not exist. It it didn't just hallucinate those cases; it made them up. We like this word hallucination because it seems far fetched. But this is the problem with these kinds of technologies is they make things up. And it's very important to, even if you think it's helpful to you, to cut down on your time by, let's say, having ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini frame a subject area that you want to write about. If you don't if you don't really check to be sure that that framing is accurate, then you should be penalized. Or if you submit a paper that was just totally written, then frankly, I think you should either cite that that's what you have done, or be penalized when somebody comes back to you and said, "Well, where's your work in this?" Other than having framed a question to a large language model, because it still is pretty identifiable when something has been written by a chatbot as opposed to when a knowledgeable human has done a good and creative editing job.
Yeah, interesting. I think we sort of in a rabbit hole because people don't want to use AI, but they are using AI to do less and get more outcomes of it. We are sort of pressurized at work to do more. We have less time. And yeah, we're going in circles, sort of.
We are, and the point is, there's no intelligence anywhere. People are being stupid. They're relying on technology that gives the illusion of intelligence, but has limited forms of intelligence. So, I mean, the question is it going to dumb us down, or are some people going to utilize the systems in ways that actually which I say merge with their own understanding and yield some creative insight?
So do you think AI has changed how we define intelligence now?
Well, AI has dumbed down how we define intelligence. Whether it's totally altered it's a little complicated. I think part of the problem is that there's been this pursuit of this god of intelligence, artificial general intelligence, as if intelligence alone is some measure of understanding. There's a distinction between understanding and the kinds of pattern matching that come out of AI systems. And people who think that that pattern matching, though it may be good enough to win victory on a quiz show, is full intelligence, that's our stupidity. That's our mistake. That comprehension, that motivation, that consciousness, that empathy, that all kinds of things that we think are fundamental attributes of an intelligent, worthy, virtuous human being are not implemented in these systems. That's something we need to educate others about, but it's also something we can't give people license because they don't.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing and shedding more light on this. Is there something uniquely human that you believe cannot be replicated by AI?
Yeah, I
Or
think
do you think?
I have not. It's debated, but I have not seen evidence that AI can be conscious or have moral intelligence. And I certainly don't think AI is empathetic in any way. Nor do I think AI is motivated to be creative the way human beings are. So far, I have not seen evidence that those capabilities are instantiable within computational systems. And I think all of that is critical. And unless they can be instantiated in intelligent systems, we really need to rely upon, what should I say, partnerships between humans and AI, where ultimate decision making lies with humans. If we don't, we are abrogating responsibility and authority to machines. We are stupidly putting them in the positions of making decisions where they don't necessarily have all the capabilities to make the appropriate decisions. And particularly in situations such as warfare, that's going to lead to civilian casualties.
Okay, I got it. And after decades in this field, what belief have you changed your mind about AI? I mean, has your engagement with AI made you personally more patient, more skeptical, or more urgent?
Um, well, I think the urgency is real. The urgency is real because the the tendency of humans to put AI in situations where it makes critical decisions has grown exponentially, while their capacity to make those decisions has not. And so there's an urgency there, and the urgency is compounded by what my colleague Gary Marchant and others labeled a pacing problem, which is the gap between the pace of technology and the speed at which we can put legal, ethical oversight in place. So I think I, it's not that I'm impatient as much as I'm deeply concerned about the future of humanity under these circumstances. And I see that we are creating narratives that are largely stupid narratives that serve the interests of some groups of people, particularly the technological oligopoly, but actually have put humanity on a course um, where we ratchet up tension with China over AI and the competition between America and China. Um, Due to AI, we don't regulate innovations in AI because we think that will get in the way of our ability to win the so-called race. That we have competition over artificial general intelligence without putting in place the appropriate safeguards, whether those are technological, legal, or ethical. So that causes great concern for me. I think we are on the wrong path, and we will pay the price for that. And the question is how large that price is going. The question is only how large that price will be. You and I happen to be talking at a critical juncture in that development. So over the last few days, Anthropic, the company that makes Claude, one of the leading AI tools, has been negotiating with and has refused to let the US military use its tools for anything. Yeah. And the two areas that I was most concerned about are surveillance and the use of Claude for autonomous weapons systems. So, in the midst of their negotiations, Donald Trump declared that the government can no longer buy from Anthropic. And furthermore, Pete Hegseth, the head of the Defense Department, sometimes called by the Trump administration the Department of War, has declared that Anthropic is a national security risk. Now, those two actions are unprecedented when dealing with a domestic company. They're basically undermining the government's capacity to deal with Anthropic at all. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley, turning on the Trump administration's actions, has rallied around Anthropic and said, well, this is creating an opportunity for the tech firms to come together around these ethical concerns. But to make matters worse, just yesterday, this has all happened in the last couple days, just yesterday, OpenAI, led by Sam Altman, has declared that they have come to an agreement with the US military for the military to use OpenAI's tools, largely the various versions of ChatGPT. And he has declared that we can put safeguards in place to ensure that our tools are not used for either mass surveillance or for autonomous weapon systems. Now, neither OpenAI nor any other company has demonstrated that they can put such tools, such technological safeguards in their systems. So this is all posturing, and this is Sam Altman taking advantage of Anthropic's, which I say, tensions with the Trump administration to create a competitive advantage for his company, OpenAI. And unfortunately, it's not the first time that OpenAI has put, which I say, its competitive advantage ahead of its ethics. So again, we have politicized the use of these large language models. We're going to make some liberal and some conservative and some woke and some MAGA. And in the process, we have undermined one of the great opportunities for the corporations to take seriously these two critical issues in AI ethics, not to mention the other issues that are critical, but these particular critical issues. And to exacerbate matters, as I am speaking here, a war over Iraq has been initiated. And I'm not going to make comments about whether this war is or is not appropriate. But what that has done has pushed the story about what Anthropic, what OpenAI, and what the Trump administration are doing right now to a secondary or tertiary status. These were the top news stories until the invasion of Iran. Did I say Iraq earlier? It's Iran. The necessity for everybody to focus on Iran has distracted our attention from perhaps what is one of the most important stories in the evolution or devolution of AI ethics that has come along in a few years. So this is just one more example of corporations like OpenAI ethics washing, trying to look like they're being ethical when in fact they're undermining AI ethics. And, I don't know whether Anthropic is making its decisions because it's truly being ethical in these matters or whether it's a corporate market decision making that they'll surrender the Defense Department to other systems while they claim the high ground. It doesn't matter. But this is a critical juncture and one that I'm afraid will not get appropriate attention because we are distracted by other factors. Now, interestingly enough, the decision to declare Anthropic a national security risk was made very rapidly while we were in the midst of negotiations with Anthropic. And Anthropic probably didn't perceive these negotiations as something that had to be settled overnight. But overnight, they were declared a national security risk. And strangely enough, overnight, or maybe not so coincidentally, a decision was made to invade Iran or to bomb Iran while we're ostensibly in the midst of negotiations that, at least according to some parties, were moving along fairly well. So that's where we are. And that's not just about AI ethics. That's about geopolitical stability. That's about the future well-being of our children. All being decided with very knee-jerk reactions that serve political and economic purposes for the involved companies, but do not take into account the well-being of humanity.
Thank you very much. I got it. Thank you for sharing your opinion on this one, which is very important. If a young AI researcher asked you what is the one moral habit I should cultivate, what would you tell them?
One moral habit they should cultivate.
Yes.
Um, well, whether it's one moral habit or a collection of many moral habits is a rather long philosophical discussion. First of all, I would be in awe if a young researcher asked me that. and But the fact is, perhaps some do in various ways, and I'm thrilled that we might get questions like that. But I think the habit is virtue, and as Aristotle said, the cultivation of virtue is also a habit. So we have something very circular going on there. But virtue is really about having character, about cultivating moral intelligence, about meaning what you say, about not compromising your integrity because it gives you some monetary or political advantage. And unfortunately, virtue is not a characteristic we talk about as much as we talk about intelligence. In fact, Shannon Beller and I wrote a paper together that AI systems will not be moral machines unless we can inculcate them with virtue. And at the moment, we are far away from doing that.
Social media has poisoned us already over decades now, and now AI is next on the line. Everyone has a different opinion on this, but what do you think, in your opinion, is the key to successful and fulfilling life? I mean, I'm particularly asking this from your point of view, telling the younger generations that are growing up and are going to be responsible for our future and maybe better being. What would you think, or what would you share and tell others?
I think that's the same answers I gave to the last question. So it's a different question, and they're both very good questions. And I'm with Aristotle and the Buddha and Confucius on that. That the cultivation of character is what's central here, and it's something we give very little attention to in modern society. Everybody wants to have the latest and greatest gadget and be powerful and have money. Um, but actually, the extent to which we compromise ourselves in that pursuit is totally lost. So that's why I talk about the cultivation of moral intelligence quite a bit. But it's really just kind of a surrogate for the cultivation of a virtuous character. By virtue, I mean somebody who is engaged and responsive and integrated within themselves and in relationship to the environments they are moving through and the people they are interacting with. And perhaps it even has a spiritual dimension, meaning we don't just interact, but we share a body together. We share we share an environment together. We may each be individual nexuses of consciousness within the sea of relationships, but it is the responsibility of each of us to have an integrated and responsive relationship to that sea of relationships. And that, the cultivation of that kind of character is something that you almost have to turn to the ancients to understand. But the problem is the ancients were ancients. They were in their own environment, and their environments did not include technology, particularly AI, but also biotech and nanotech and neuroscience and so forth. So what virtue will mean, what moral intelligence will mean in the information age is not something we can totally rely on the ancients to tell us. They can point to what it means to be engaged. But moral intelligence, character in the information age, is something we have to reimagine. And that, by the way, is the project I'm working on right now. I call it moral intelligence in the digital age.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Got it. Thank you for sharing. AI is sort of scaring people. We already said it a million times, but for younger people in particular, because they are not exposed anymore to the nature, going out, not being outside interacting, networking necessarily. Everything is on the keyboard in front of the computer, and AI is not making it easier. But if someone is starting out in their career or profession, what piece of advice would you give them? Any tips, any ideas? Because I'm asking, you work in the AI space and everyone is worried about their jobs. And if someone is going to uni right now, they might not know whether the decision is right or wrong, whether they should become a lawyer, doctor, or whatever it is, a programmer, because AI may
Well,
kill it.
well, obviously, our individual needs and those of our families, or those we are responsible for, come first. And you're gonna, you may do whatever you think you have to do to fulfill those responsibilities. But it's important to recognize that if the short term fulfilling of those responsibilities also entails compromising your character and integrity, you will pay for it in the long run. You will pay for it in the form of disease, perhaps an early death, emptiness, alienation, psychological fragmentation, all kinds of things. And we have lost sight of that. We have lost sight of human possibility and human maturation and individual evolution. So I don't begrudge people sometimes making bad choices or sometimes making choices that they think they have to make because of the responsibilities they have taken upon themselves. There's a line in a famous song that goes, be, be not too hard if he's bought his soul because he must do as best he can. Be not too hard, for nothing is given to men or to mankind. So that's true. It's not easy, and some of us, I actually am grateful every day when I realize the blessings I have had and the opportunities to live on, what shall I say, the resourcefully good side of humanity, where I'm not, you know, I haven't gone through many days without food in my life. So I understand that I've lived a life of privilege. Sometimes I resent that I have not been given more recognition or more success or more financial rewards and so forth. But the reality is, I made choices throughout my life that were about my integrity as being more important than the external rewards I have been given. And now, as I look back on the decades, I just say, thank my lucky stars, how lucky I was not to have received X opportunity or Y reward, because in retrospect, I see that the people who took those sold their soul on the way. I don't think I've sold my soul. I think my soul's in pretty good tact. May not be the same soul as the ancients talked about 2,000 years ago, but they didn't have our modern scientific understanding. So maybe it is the same soul. It's just that the languages we will use are more technological, are more neuroscientific, are more caught up in the physics and biology of what it means to be human. But from my perspective, whether you are religious or not, there is a soul, a representation of your own integration, well being, and character. And it's not the same thing as how healthy your body is or how many rewards the society has bestowed upon you.
That's very powerful advice. And yeah, thank you very much for sharing this. And is there a piece of advice you've received throughout your life from anyone that stuck with you? And if yes, why? And would you mind sharing it?
Yeah, this kind of gets us down a more looking at more what spiritual understanding in the modern era might be than just than just good advice. But I had a teacher who helped me understand a great deal about mental activity, cognitive activity, and what it represents, and the value of those spaces that we might think of as quiet or silent. During the 60s and 70s, there was pursuit of inner quiet and silence, largely in the name of acquiring altered mental states. That was a doorway to altered mental states. And in the perhaps modern era, we talk about these things as doorways to creativity or excellence in sports or something like that. So that's all well and good, but I think what I came to understand and the advice I got was that silence is not, or inner understanding or integration is not something that is achievable. It is the byproduct of attending to what is at hand and attending to your thoughts and inquiring into what they want and what they need. And that has been critical in my lifetime, that kind of an inquiry. And I thank a man, particularly Dr. Kaushik, who was seminal in my understanding of that. But I see that a similar message has come out of wise people throughout history. And now I'm trying to add one other little note to that, and that's what I call moral decision making in the digital age, and that's about what the cultivation of inner quiet means in decision making processes. And I'm going to put it very simplistically here. I call it the silent ethic. But what I mean by a silent ethic is when confronted with the choice, choose that option or those options which are leading to a relative degree of inner quiet, and eschew those options that leave you in conflict because you aren't really solving the problem at the hand. You're just deferring its resolution. So that's rather sophisticated advice, and the chapter I'm adding to that requires a degree of understanding and discrimination. It's not some simplistic little aphorism, but I would say that's been critical in my life, and I hope I can add a chapter in the cultivation of that kind of understanding, a kind of understanding that I don't think computational systems will ever achieve, regardless of how smart they are. They're already much smarter than me. I'm just one more dude out there who's absorbed what he can absorb and has kind of created his own worldview out of what he can absorb, but or at least is conscious that he has absorbed. But AI systems will be much smarter than that. They may actually even have multiple worldviews, but they will never have that kind of intelligence that I can see, at least not in the near future. What will take place in the more distant future when we have, machines that ostensibly seem to be conscious or have affective, emotional inputs and outputs and do something more in the way of compassion than just computing a bunch of different numbers and weights and giving a compassionate output. That's a different universe. I still think we're quite a ways away from that, and therefore there will always be a role for humans in decision making. It may be in relationship with the machine inputs and outputs they have, but there's a critical role for people, and hopefully it's a role that people eventually get paid for. But in the meantime, it's not a job; it's a commitment.
I got it. Thank you very much for sharing this. And when history looks back at this period of AI development, what do you hope it says about the choices we made?
Well, I hope they feel that we have made decent choices that sustain humanity and sustain life, and that we correct what seems to be a rather destructive course that we are on right now. The world population is somewhat over 8 billion at the moment, and I can't remember exactly where the prediction are, but somewhere around 2050 it's expected to be 9 billion. But it could also be 6 billion. And that represents tremendous pain and suffering. But at least 6 billion is not 5 billion. And so those of us who may be disappointed in our failures still have to do what we can to ameliorate the amount of suffering and harm that are out there. But my great hope, at the moment it feels like a great fantasy, is that we will reach 9 million people, and that the livelihood and quality of life for all of them will be at least as good, if not better, than what those of us who are advantaged in richer countries are living. Not necessarily material be better, but better in terms of quality of life. My hopes is that we will achieve that AI will have been significant in bringing that about. But frankly, at the moment, even though I'm a cup is half full man, and I think we'll find a way, even if that way may require some tragedies for us to right the course. At the moment, I recognize that my hope is a pretty wild fantasy.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I've got a cup which says always half full, so just to keep me always reminded of the things we actually have. And yeah, thank you very much for sharing all the stories and your interesting insights about AI and the world in general. I've got one more final question for you.
Sure.
And you've shared already everything and quite a lot, and people can chew on this and absorb it and digest it in their own time and way, however they want to do it. But is there, apart from what you said, final words of wisdom you would want to particularly leave the younger generations with? Aside from whatever you shared already in this interview, and you said anything else you can think of and leave them pondering maybe and thinking about, yeah, what the future beholds or how we should maybe, live our life or deal with AI or whatever it is.
So I've lived a pretty idiosyncratic life. There's so many things about my life that are not normal, and yet here I am in my older years. I don't want to say I don't want to say that I'm coming to the end of my life, but here I am in my older years. I'm actually quite a bit older, by the way, than most people believe or think I look. Um, and someone like you is interviewing me for whatever pearls of wisdom I might be able to pass on. I'm not trying to make anything special about who I am, but my message to younger generations is follow the better angels of yourself. Make those choices that make you feel more integrated and that you think in retrospect you will be proud of. A pathway will be open for you. It may not be a pathway that gives you all the social rewards that you hope for, but it's a pathway where you will be able to look back upon it and say, perhaps I made a little difference. Even if you didn't make a little difference, it will be a pathway that you will be proud of. And though I can't promise that, there may be somebody like Matt who asked you in your older age what pearls of wisdom you can share.
That's very deep, but thank you very much, Wendell, for sharing this. I truly appreciate it.
I want to
Maybe
thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about some of these things, because I don't always get that opportunity. A lot of people think of me as having technical recommendations on governance and what should I say, critiques of what's going on. But I appreciate that you gave me this opportunity to share some of these reflections with your audience.